Chicago, 2021. The wind howled through the city's towering skyscrapers, carrying the sting of winter's icy breath. Snow blanketed the streets, muffling the usual chaos of traffic and footsteps. Amid the blur of hurried people, a sleek black luxury car pulled up to the curb, its engine purring like a tiger. Behind the wheel sat James, one of Chicago's wealthiest men, a name that appeared on every rich and influential list in the country. James wasn't just rich, he was untouchable. His wealth had built empires, but his heart had grown cold in the process. He rarely ventured out of his cushioned world of penthouses and private jets, but something about this cold December day had drawn him to the streets. As he looked out through his tinted window, something unusual caught his eye. A young boy, no older than 10 or 11, sitting alone on a worn piece of cardboard. His clothes were too thin for the freezing weather, a patchy sweater and jeans with holes too large to ignore. But it wasn't the boy's poverty that stopped James in his tracks. It was the sign in his hands. "I don't want money. I want a chance." Intrigued, James turned off the engine, grabbed his coat, and stepped onto the icy sidewalk. His Italian leather shoes crunched against the snow as he approached the boy. "Hey, kid," James called out, his voice confident and commanding, the kind that made people listen. "What's this about not wanting money? Everyone wants money." The boy didn't look up immediately, his fingers gripping the edges of the sign as though it was a shield. Finally, he raised his face, his eyes startlingly clear and direct despite the dirt smeared across his cheeks. "I don't need your charity," the boy said simply, his voice steady, though his breath came out in puffs of cold air. James chuckled, more out of disbelief than amusement. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, extending it toward the boy. "Come on, kid. You're freezing. Take this and get yourself something to eat." But the boy didn't move. Instead, he fixed James with a gaze so unflinching that it made the millionaire hesitate. "No, thanks," the boy said. "I don't need your money." James raised an eyebrow. In his world, money was the solution to everything. Problems dissolved in the presence of wealth. People never refused him, ever. "Listen," James said, crouching slightly to meet the boy's eye level. "You're out here in the cold with nothing. This could buy you a hot meal and a coat. Why not take it?" The boy's lips tightened, as if he was holding something back. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Because money doesn't fix anything. You don't understand, do you?" He paused, his small hands gripping his sign harder. I just need someone to listen. Just one person." James blinked, caught off guard. A strange mix of irritation and curiosity flickered across his face. What kind of kid turns down money in this situation? He stuffed the bill back into his pocket, his curiosity now fully piqued. "All right," James said, leaning against the street lamp. "I'm listening. What's so important that you turned down free money?" The boy hesitated, as if weighing whether James was worth his trust. His small frame shivered in the cold, but his resolve remained unshaken. Then he took a deep breath and said something that made James's world stop. What the boy asked wasn't what James expected. It wasn't simple, and it wasn't easy. It was raw, unfiltered, and it dug into places James had buried long ago. In that instant, the arrogant millionaire wasn't standing in front of a poor boy anymore. He was standing in front of a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. The streets of Chicago were William's home, but they had never truly felt like it. At only 11 years old, he had spent more nights sleeping under bridges and in doorways than in a real bed. Life hadn't always been this way for him. There was a time, though it felt like a distant dream, when William had a family, a home, and a future that didn't seem so grim. But that was before the accident. It had been a cold night, much like this one, when the fire took everything. A faulty space heater sparked in the tiny apartment William shared with his parents, and within minutes, flames consumed their lives. His father died trying to save them, and his mother was left severely injured, unable to work or care for him. With no relatives to take him in, and no system willing to intervene, William found himself on the streets, surviving on scraps and willpower. But William wasn't just surviving. He was dreaming. Every night, no matter how cold or lonely it got, he held on to the belief that things could change. He'd scrawl ideas in the margins of old newspapers he found in the trash, sketching plans for inventions and businesses. He didn't want to be another forgotten kid in a broken system. He wanted to make a mark, to build something real. That's why he'd written those words on his sign. "I don't want money. I want a chance." Across town, James's life couldn't have been more different. Born into wealth, he grew up in a mansion filled with marble floors and sparkling chandeliers. But even in his golden cradle, something was missing. His parents were always busy, jet-setting around the globe for business deals and charity galas. They provided everything he could ever want, except their presence. James learned early on that money spoke louder than words. It was his armor, his weapon, and his solution. By the time he was 25, he'd turned his inheritance into an empire, buying failing companies and flipping them for billions. He built skyscrapers and crushed competitors, earning a reputation as a ruthless businessman. But beneath the polished suits and boardroom victories, there was a void he couldn't ignore. His relationships were transactional, his friendships superficial. James avoided looking too closely at himself, afraid of what he might find. He buried his doubts under piles of work and luxury, convincing himself that success was enough. But in rare moments of silence, when the parties ended and the deals were done, he felt the weight of his choices. When he saw William sitting on that corner, something about the boy unsettled him. Maybe it was the resilience in those young eyes, or the defiance in his refusal of the money. But James couldn't shake the feeling that this kid, this random stranger, saw through him in a way no one else ever had. As James listened to William's story, bits and pieces of his own childhood came rushing back. The loneliness, the craving for something money couldn't buy. He had spent his whole life running from it, and now, here it was, staring him in the face. And then there was William, clinging to a hope that James himself had abandoned long ago. The boy's dreams weren't tarnished by cynicism or greed. They were pure, desperate, and brimming with determination. For William, the world was a storm he was determined to weather. For James, it was a storm he thought he had already conquered. But meeting William made him realize he was still lost in it. As the snow fell heavier that night, James found himself wondering, was this chance meeting a coincidence, or was it something more? Was the boy just another beggar on the street, or was he a reflection of something James had forgotten, a part of himself he'd buried in his climb to the two? The city's biting wind howled louder as James stood in front of William, still trying to make sense of the boy's defiance. The $1 million man, used to people bending over backwards for a scrap of his fortune, now faced a child who didn't just refuse his money. He wanted something more. "You've got my attention, kid," James said, crossing his arms. His polished leather shoes were now wet with snow, but he didn't care. "What's this chance you keep talking about? What do you want from me?" William took a deep breath, his small frame shivering as he gripped the cardboard sign tighter. "I need help with something," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "But it's not money. I need someone who can actually do something, not just throw cash at a problem." James arched a brow. "I don't exactly do things. I pay people to fix things." "Then maybe you've never done anything real," William shot back, the words leaving his lips before he could think better of it. James blinked, caught off guard by the boy's boldness. He could have walked away right then, dismissed William as another insolent kid. But there was something in those words, a challenge, a truth he wasn't ready to admit that kept him rooted to the spot. "All right, tough guy," James said, leaning against a nearby lamppost. "Tell me, what's this big thing you need help with?" William hesitated for a moment, his frostbitten fingers fidgeting nervously. Then he pointed to the corner of the block where a dilapidated brick building stood, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. "That place used to be a shelter," William explained, his voice softer now, filled with a quiet determination. "It was the only place where my mom and I could get warm, eat something, and feel safe. But they shut it down months ago. No one cared. Now the people who used to go there are out here, freezing." James glanced at the building, its neglected facade blending into the gray cityscape. He remembered passing places like this before, always ignoring them, never stopping to think about the lives they touched. "So, what are you asking me to do?" James asked, his voice more serious now. "Fix it," William said simply, meeting James's gaze with an intensity that felt far too mature for his age. "You have the power to bring it back. You can talk to the people who can make it happen. You can save it." James straightened up, his defenses kicking in. "Kid, I'm not some philanthropist. I build skyscrapers by companies. I don't deal with stuff like this." William didn't flinch. "But you could," he said firmly. "You could make it matter. You could make it real." James was silent, staring at the boy in disbelief. For someone so young, William spoke with a conviction that cut through all the noise James was used to hearing. This wasn't a plea for survival. It was a plea for justice, for humanity, for something bigger than either of them. "What's in it for you?" James asked, trying to rationalize why this boy would care so much. William's face softened, and for the first time, his voice wavered. "My mom," he said quietly. "She's out here too. She's sick, and I can't take care of her alone. But if the shelter comes back, maybe she has a chance. Maybe a lot of people do." James felt something crack inside him. He'd expected a sob story, a manipulation, something that he could dismiss as self-serving. But this was raw, unfiltered truth. And it wasn't just about William or his mother. It was about a broken system that James had spent his life ignoring. "You're serious about this," James said finally, his tone quieter, almost thoughtful. "I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't," William replied. James looked back at the shelter, then at William. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't name, a pull to do something that wasn't for his own gain. "All right," he said slowly, almost begrudgingly. "I'll look into it. No promises." William's face lit up, the first hint of a smile breaking through his tired expression. But it wasn't just hope for himself. It was hope for everyone who had been forgotten. As James turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't just about fixing a building. It was about fixing something in himself that he hadn't even realized was broken. That night, James sat at his penthouse overlooking Chicago's sparkling skyline. The city seemed so alive from above, lights twinkling, cars weaving through the streets, but for the first time, it all felt hollow. His glass of scotch sat untouched on the sleek, black table in front of him as his mind kept circling back to the boy on the corner. William's face wouldn't leave him alone. Those defiant, determined eyes. The quiet conviction in his voice. "Maybe you've never done anything real." The words replayed like a broken record, each time cutting deeper. James rose from his leather armchair and paced, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He had built skyscrapers that defined the city's skyline. He had saved dying corporations and turned them into giants. But now, standing in his pristine living room, surrounded by all the symbols of his success, he couldn't help but wonder, had any of it really mattered? He walked to the massive glass window and stared down at the streets below. Somewhere out there, William and his mother were shivering in the cold, while he stood in his heated penthouse with everything he could ever want. But James hadn't always been so detached. There was a time, years ago, when he wanted to change the world. He remembered being a young man full of ambition, dreaming not just of wealth, but of creating something meaningful. Yet, as the years passed, success became his only goal, and the passion that once drove him faded into greed. The shelter William had pointed out triggered memories James had buried deep. As a boy, he'd occasionally snuck out of his parents' mansion, wandering through the city, trying to escape the emptiness of his gilded life. On one of those nights, he'd stumbled into a similar shelter. The warmth, the kindness of the volunteers, and the way they treated everyone with dignity had left an impression on him. But as he grew older, he dismissed those memories as sentimental foolishness. Life, he'd told himself, was about winners and losers, and he was determined to win. Yet now, standing in the silence of his apartment, James realized how much he had lost in the process. The next morning, James made a decision. He arrived at his office, where his assistant Claire greeted him with the day's schedule. Meetings, calls, contracts. It was the same routine that had made him one of the richest men in Chicago. But today, James wasn't interested. "Cancel everything," he said abruptly, shrugging off his coat. Claire blinked, stunned. "Sir? Cancel everything?" "You heard me," he said, already dialing a number on his phone. Over the next few hours, James dug into the history of the abandoned shelter. He learned it had once been a lifeline for hundreds of families, but budget cuts and bureaucracy had forced it to close. The city had moved on, as it always did, leaving the most vulnerable behind. James's stomach churned as he read the reports. This wasn't just about one building. It was about a system that had failed people like William and his mother over and over again. For years, James had lived in a bubble, his wealth insulating him from the harsh realities of the world. He had convinced himself that writing a check to a charity every now and then was enough. But it wasn't, not even close. He picked up the phone and made another call, this time to one of the city's top architects. "I need plans drawn up," he said. "I'm rebuilding a shelter, and it has to be done right. State of the art. No corners cut." The architect hesitated. "Mr. Harris, projects like this usually take months, sometimes years." "I don't care how long it takes," James interrupted. "Just start. Now." By the end of the day, James had set wheels in motion that couldn't be undone. But the work wasn't just external, it was internal. For every call he made, for every decision he pushed forward, he felt the walls he'd built around himself start to crack. The cynicism that had defined his life began to dissolve, replaced by something unfamiliar: responsibility, compassion, purpose. That night, James returned to the corner where he'd met William. The boy was there again, his sign propped up against his knees, his breath visible in the freezing air. "I looked into it," James said, crouching down so they were eye level. "The shelter's going to be rebuilt, and not just for your mom, for everyone." William stared at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You mean it?" James nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah, kid, I mean it." For the first time in years, James felt something stir in his chest. It wasn't pride or self-congratulation. It was a sense of connection, of doing something that truly mattered. And it all started with a boy who refused to take his money. The days that followed James's promise were a whirlwind of activity. Architects began drafting plans for the shelter, and James personally oversaw every detail. For the first time in years, he felt invigorated. Not by profits or accolades, but by the prospect of doing something meaningful. But beneath the surface, something still nagged at him. William's determination, his refusal to accept money, his focus on the shelter, it all seemed too purposeful for a child his age. James had dealt with countless people trying to manipulate him, and while he didn't believe William was lying, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the boy's story than he'd revealed. Determined to learn the truth, James hired a private investigator. "I need everything you can find on a boy named William," he told the investigator. "He's about 11, no known last name, homeless, and his mother is sick. Start with the area near Lincoln Avenue." The investigator nodded, not questioning James's unusual request. Meanwhile, James continued his visits to William. Each time, he brought food and warm clothing, though William always shared the food with others on the street. James admired the boy's selflessness, but couldn't ignore the tension in his posture whenever the subject of his mother came up. "Is she okay?" James asked one evening as they sat on the curb, sharing a pizza James had brought. William shrugged, his eyes fixed on the snow-covered street. "She's managing," he said. "I do what I can." James frowned. "Why haven't I met her? Where is she staying?" William's jaw tightened, and he didn't answer. Before James could press further, his phone buzzed. It was the investigator. "I've got something," the man said. "You're not going to like it." The investigator's report came with photos, documents, and witness statements. James read through it that night, each page pulling him deeper into a story he hadn't expected. William's mother, Emily, was indeed alive but gravely ill. She suffered from late-stage cancer and had been avoiding hospitals because she couldn't afford treatment. Her pride, much like her son's, kept her from seeking help. But that wasn't the part that stunned James. The report revealed that Emily had once worked for one of James's companies, a cleaning job at one of his luxury hotels. Years ago, she'd been injured on the job when faulty equipment caused her to fall. The incident had left her with permanent back problems, and though she'd filed a claim, the company's lawyers had buried her in legal red tape until she gave up. James's stomach churned as he read the details. It wasn't just a random twist of fate that had brought William into his life. It was his own negligence, his own company's greed, that had set this tragedy in motion. Emily's fall had cost her everything: her job, her home, her health. And now, her son was fighting to save her life while James sat in his penthouse, oblivious to the ripple effects of his empire's carelessness. The next day, James returned to the corner where William was waiting, bundled in a coat James had given him. "William," James said, his voice quieter than usual, "we need to talk." William looked up, his expression wary. "What's wrong?" James knelt down, meeting the boy's gaze. "I found out about your mom, about what happened to her at my hotel." For the first time, William's composure cracked. His eyes widened and his hands clenched into fists. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want your pity," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't want you to feel sorry for us. I just wanted you to help fix the shelter." James placed a hand on William's shoulder, his expression filled with guilt. "You're right to be angry. What happened to your mom was my responsibility, even if I didn't know about it at the time. I should have been paying attention, and now I need to make it right." William's eyes searched James's face, looking for signs of insincerity, but all he saw was regret and a determination to change. "I'm going to help her," James said firmly, "not just with the shelter. I'm going to make sure she gets the care she needs. I owe her that, and I owe you, too." For a long moment, William said nothing. Then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a shaky breath. "Okay," he whispered, "but don't break your promises. Not to me and not to her." James nodded, his jaw tight with resolve. "I won't." As James walked away that evening, the weight of his past decisions bore down on him. The truth about Emily and William wasn't just a coincidence. It was a reckoning. Their suffering had been a result of the system he had benefited from, and now he had a chance to do something about it. But this wasn't just about redemption. It was about responsibility. And for the first time, James understood what it meant to truly change a life. James wasn't a man who believed in fate, but the weight of his connection to William and Emily felt undeniable. The revelation of his company's negligence haunted him, but rather than paralyze him, it ignited something he hadn't felt in years: urgency. He had to make things right. Not with a check, not with a press release, but with action. The first step was Emily. James pulled every string he could, calling top medical professionals and specialists in the city. Within 24 hours, Emily was admitted to one of Chicago's premier hospitals. Despite her protests, James made it clear he wasn't taking no for an answer. "Your son is the most extraordinary kid I've ever met," James told her during his first visit to the hospital. "He fought for you when no one else would. Let me do my part now." Emily, frail and pale, stared at James with a mixture of gratitude and resentment. "You think fixing this makes up for everything we've lost?" she asked, her voice cracking. James didn't flinch. "No, it doesn't. But it's a start. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you never feel abandoned again." Her silence was heavy, but in her eyes, James saw a flicker of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. As Emily received treatment, James turned his focus to the shelter. The plans had been finalized, and construction crews were already clearing the lot. But James knew that rebuilding the shelter wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about creating something sustainable. He called a meeting with local leaders, philanthropists, and social workers, inviting them to his office. For years, these people had written him letters, begged for donations, and tried to get his attention, only to be ignored. Now, they sat across from him, skeptical but curious. "I'll be blunt," James began, his tone direct. "I've failed the city in ways I didn't even realize. But I want to change that. The shelter on Lincoln Avenue is just the beginning. I need your help to turn it into more than a temporary fix." One woman, a longtime community organizer, crossed her arms. "Why now? What made you suddenly care?" James hesitated. He could have spun a story, deflected, but instead he told the truth. "A boy named William," he said simply. "He reminded me that people like me have a responsibility to do more than write checks. He made me see what I've ignored for too long." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, people began to speak. Ideas flowed. Job training programs, mental health services, addiction recovery resources. James took notes, committing himself to understanding the needs of the community rather than imposing his own solutions. At the end of the meeting, as the attendees filed out, the organizer who had challenged him stopped by his desk. "If you're serious about this," she said, "it's going to take more than money. It's going to take time, commitment, and listening." James nodded. "I'm ready for that." Throughout it all, James kept William involved. He took the boy to the construction site, showing him the blueprints and introducing him to the workers. William's eyes lit up as he saw the walls of the new shelter beginning to take shape. "You're really doing it," William said one day, standing in the shadow of the growing structure. "We're doing it," James corrected. "This was your idea, William. You made this happen." But even as the project progressed, James couldn't ignore the deeper lesson William had taught him. The boy hadn't just wanted a shelter rebuilt. He wanted to show James that real change required more than wealth. It required heart, sacrifice, and humility. One evening, James took William to dinner at a modest diner, away from the glitz and glamour of his usual haunts. Over plates of greasy burgers and fries, they talked. Not about shelters or business, but about life. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" James asked. William hesitated, then smiled. "I don't know. Maybe someone who helps people. Like what you're doing now." James felt a lump in his throat. "Then you're already ahead of me." It took me decades to figure that out. The more time James spent with William, the more he felt himself changing. He no longer saw his wealth as a shield, but as a tool, a responsibility to be used for good. He sold off one of his luxury properties, donating the proceeds to fund additional community programs. He began visiting other parts of the city he'd ignored, learning from the people who lived there. For the first time, James felt like he was building something truly lasting, not just buildings, but a legacy of compassion. As the shelter's grand opening approached, James knew it wasn't the end of his journey. It was the beginning, and at the center of it all was a boy who had the courage to stand up to a millionaire and demand something more. The grand opening of the newly rebuilt shelter was a day James wouldn't forget. The brisk winter air bit at his cheeks as he stepped onto the stage erected in front of the gleaming new building. A modest crowd had gathered, community leaders, volunteers, and families who would soon call the shelter a temporary haven. William stood beside James, dressed in a donated coat that still looked a size too big. His wide eyes took in the building as if he couldn't believe it was real. The once crumbling structure had been transformed into a vibrant, modern facility, complete with family dormitories, a communal kitchen, classrooms, and even a small clinic. The sign above the entrance read, "The Lincoln Hope Center." James approached the podium, his palms slightly sweaty, a rare sensation for the man used to addressing boardrooms of skeptical executives. But this was different. This wasn't about profit margins or stockholders. This was about people. He cleared his throat, his voice steady as he spoke. Today isn't about me. It's about the countless individuals who fought for the city's most vulnerable when I wasn't paying attention. It's about a boy who reminded me that real change starts with listening, with acting, and with taking responsibility. The audience murmured, a few heads turning toward William, who flushed under the sudden attention. James continued, "This center isn't just a building. It's a promise that no one in this city will be invisible again." His voice faltered for a moment, but he steadied himself. "To everyone here today, thank you for showing me the kind of man I want to be. And to William, thank you for showing me the kind of man I need to be." The applause was thunderous, but James barely heard it. His eyes were on William, who gave him a small, proud smile that felt more rewarding than any accolade James had ever received. After the ceremony, James and William walked through the center together. The boy marveled at every detail. The warm colors on the walls, the rows of bunk beds, the shelves stacked with books and toys. "You did good," William said, his voice filled with awe. "We did good," James corrected, smiling down at him. As they reached the end of the tour, Emily appeared, leaning on a cane but looking far healthier than she had weeks ago. Her treatment was ongoing, but the doctors were optimistic. She looked at James, her expression softer than it had been before. "You've done more than I ever thought possible," Emily said quietly. "Thank you." James shook his head. "I'm just making up for lost time." But then William stepped forward, clutching something in his hands. It was a small, crumpled envelope. He handed it to James, his face suddenly serious. "What's this?" James asked, confused. "Just open it," William urged. James carefully tore the envelope open. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper with a handwritten note. The words were simple but hit him harder than any speech or applause. "Thank you for helping my mom, but I think you need this more than me." Attached to the note was a dollar bill, the same dollar James had tried to give William on the day they met. James felt his throat tighten and his vision blurred. He knelt down to William's level, clutching the note and the dollar in his hand. "Why are you giving this to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. William shrugged, his face a mix of innocence and wisdom far beyond his years. "Because now you're the one who's starting over." That single dollar became one of James's most prized possessions. It wasn't wealth or power that defined his life anymore. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple into something much larger. The shelter thrived in the weeks that followed, becoming a beacon of hope for the city. Families found safety, individuals regained their dignity, and James discovered a renewed purpose. For the first time in years, he felt whole. And as for William, he continued to visit the shelter, helping new arrivals feel at home. James made sure he had everything he needed to succeed: school, warm meals, and a stable place to grow. But William never stopped reminding James of one thing: it's not about what you have. It's about what you do with it. The grand opening wasn't the end of James's journey. It was the beginning. He launched more projects across the city, using his wealth and influence to rebuild not just structures but lives. But the true legacy of his work was a boy with unshakable integrity, a mother who found strength in her darkest moments, and a city that learned the power of collective compassion. Months had passed since the grand opening of the Lincoln Hope Center, and James's life had transformed in ways he never imagined. The shelter was thriving, offering not only temporary refuge, but long-term solutions for those who were homeless or struggling to make ends meet. The sense of purpose that had replaced his previous drive for wealth and status had seeped into every aspect of his life. He was no longer the aloof businessman who only cared about the bottom line. He was a man reshaped by his interactions with the people he once ignored. But it wasn't just the shelter that had changed. It was the city itself. As word spread about the center and the ongoing projects James was supporting, others began to take notice. Local businesses, inspired by the initiative, started contributing to the cause, donating goods, services, and even time. What had begun as one man's attempt to right his wrongs had turned into a movement, a community effort to break the cycle of poverty and neglect. Still, not everything was smooth. The pressure of overseeing such a massive shift weighed on James, and though he was committed to the cause, there were days when he found himself questioning whether it was enough. He had become a visible symbol of change, but with that visibility came scrutiny, especially from the media. Some praised him as a philanthropist, others criticized him for waiting too long to act. One rainy evening, James sat alone in his office, staring at a pile of documents related to the shelter's funding and the new initiatives. His mind wandered back to William, the boy who had sparked this entire transformation. He thought of the dollar William had given him, a gesture that had stayed with him ever since. It wasn't just about money. It was a symbol of the boy's belief in him, a reminder of the humility James needed to maintain as he moved forward. But even with all the progress, a new challenge was on the horizon. A large real estate developer had set its sights on the area around the shelter. The land, now coveted for its proximity to the city's growing downtown, was at risk of being sold off for new, luxury developments. James knew that if the shelter were moved, it would lose its impact. The people who had come to rely on it would be displaced once again. It was time for James to make a stand. The battle to protect the shelter wasn't just a legal or financial one. It was deeply personal. James found himself in boardrooms once again, this time fighting for something far more meaningful than any deal he had ever brokered. The developer had deep pockets and political connections, but James had something they didn't: the people. He organized rallies, spoke at city council meetings, and took his case directly to the public. The media, initially skeptical of his sincerity, began to shift. They saw James's commitment to the cause, the tangible changes he had brought to the community, and the faces of the people whose lives had been improved by the shelter. William's face was often in the crowd, sitting quietly and watching as James fought for what they had built together. But the pressure was mounting. There were threats, veiled and not so veiled, against the shelter's future, and James knew that the fight wouldn't be easy. As he sat across from city officials, his heart raced, not because he was scared of losing, but because he knew the people who had come to depend on the shelter didn't have the luxury of losing. "James," one of the officials said, his tone condescending, I understand your sentiment, but the city needs development. New businesses mean new jobs, new opportunities. You can't hold on to this forever." James felt his blood boil, but he kept his voice calm. "You want to build opportunities? Start with people. Start with the ones who need it most. Those businesses won't be successful if the people they're supposed to serve have nowhere to live, nowhere to turn." The room fell silent. James's words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, he felt the weight of the struggle before him. The rallying cry for the shelter spread quickly through the community. Neighborhoods that had once been divided came together to support the cause. It wasn't just about a building. It was about the heart of the city. People from all walks of life, young professionals, seniors, families, showed up in droves, holding signs and marching with a singular goal: keep the shelter open. William, once a quiet bystander, became the voice of the movement. His presence at the forefront of the protests inspired others, and the media began covering the story as a symbol of grassroots activism. What started as a child's simple request for help had now grown into a citywide call for justice, compassion, and equity. In the end, the fight was won. The developer, realizing the strength of the opposition, withdrew its plans. The shelter would remain, and the surrounding area would be preserved for the people who needed it most. James stood at the front of the crowd that day, looking out at the faces of those who had come to support the cause. Among them was William, beaming with pride, his hand resting lightly on his mother's shoulder. "See," James said, his voice full of emotion. "This is what it's all about." William nodded, his eyes reflecting a wisdom far beyond his years. "You did it. We did it." The victory was more than just the preservation of a shelter. It was the confirmation of a new path forward for James. He had realized that real change wasn't just about transforming systems. It was about transforming hearts. His journey with William had not only reshaped his own life, but had sparked a movement that would continue long after the victory. James now dedicated his time to advocating for policies that would further support the homeless and low-income families in Chicago. He continued working with local leaders, businesses, and residents, ensuring that the changes made would be sustainable. And through it all, he kept William by his side, mentoring the boy who had shown him the true meaning of giving back. As James looked out over the city he had once ignored, he knew this was only the beginning. His life had been irrevocably changed by the people he had once overlooked, and he vowed to never forget that the true measure of wealth was not in what he had, but in what he could give.